a story of ambition, power, and madness. A struggle for a throne can expose the worst in human nature. And I'm not talking about Game of Thrones. Over 400 years ago, William Shakespeare wrote one of the darkest tragedies in literature, the tragedy of Macbeth. But what few people know is that this work might be a story about a terrible disease that destroys brains, and it may not just be another story of betrayals and murders. What if Macbeth's madness was not just the result of his guilty conscience, but rather a mysterious neurodegenerative disease? A disease that challenges logic and science to this day. The fact is that scientists have found evidence in Shakespeare's work that Macbeth suffers from a disease caused by prions. Macbeth's madness can be interpreted both as a psychological problem and as cognitive neurological deterioration. Symptoms such as involuntary movements, hallucinations, and insomnia are not just signs of some degenerative disease. They are indications that the disease is caused by prions. Prions cannot be destroyed, not even by fire. And if you are infected by them, there is no turning back. You cannot see them. And if you feel something, it's already too late. No one survives, but what exactly are prions, and why are they so devastating to living beings?
Hey, Pedro here. This video you are watching was originally in Portuguese, my native language. This is the attempt of our team to translate it to English, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Your feedback is extremely important to us. Now, back to the video.
In the 18th century, Spanish shepherds observed a disease that initially had a very strange effect. It made sheep rub against fences, and not long after, the sheep would die. This disease became known as sheep's scrapie, or episodic tremor of sheep. Its origin was a mystery that took centuries to solve. At the time, the scientific community didn't even agree on whether microbes that cause diseases existed. There was no certainty about what caused diseases. For many shepherds, the sheep had been possessed by spirits. And 2 centuries later, in another part of the world, 2 scientists described a neurodegenerative disease that had a lot of similarity with what was happening to the sheep and making them sick. Both diseases began with a change in the individual's behavior that eventually led to death. The disease described by these 2 scientists is now known as creutzfeldt-jakob disease. And along with the mysterious condition that affected the sheep, it is part of a group of diseases known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. Diseases that literally turn the individual's brain into a sponge. And worst of all, they are transmissible. But here comes a detail that only added to the mystery of these diseases. They were not caused by bacteria nor viruses, much less fungi. Nothing known that caused other diseases explained why these encephalopathies existed. And to find an explanation, a revolution in our understanding of how the agents causing infectious diseases can multiply was necessary. Fungi, viruses, and bacteria use genetic code, DNA or RNA, to reproduce. But this new infection didn't even use genetic code. Its origin was a protein that was named PRION and earned the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology in 1997 for its discoverer, Stanley Prosner. For you to understand how unusual it is for a protein to replicate and cause infections, I need to make a quick digression. All life on Earth is based on genetic code, and its function is to serve as a kind of instruction manual for generating proteins. Whenever a living being reproduces and gives rise to a new living being, the genetic code is multiplied so that this new living being is also capable of synthesizing proteins. But when it comes to prions, it's as if we skip this first step that we previously considered essential. Prions don't need genetic material or anything similar to multiply. They are already the protein. They are already the final result. But then, how can a protein replicate, be infectious, and cause such serious diseases? To answer these questions, we need to better understand what a prion is. Your body already has proteins that can become prions if you are contaminated. These are normal prion proteins, which are present in various cells of your body, mainly in the cells of the central nervous system. Evidence suggests that the function of normal prion proteins is to help remove excess copper in the nervous system and to play a role in programmed cell death. But we still have much to understand about the function of these proteins. The prion that causes the disease is an altered version of the normal prion protein, which are the abnormal aberrant prion proteins. For the protein to function in the body, it's not enough for it to have the right composition. It also needs to have the right shape. The way a protein functions in the body is not only defined by its composition, but also by how it folds in space. Proteins composed of the same substances, but folded in different ways, can behave differently. And a prion is a prion protein that folds incorrectly in space and behaves differently from normal proteins, causing a disease. And this is very reminiscent of how normal body cells can be altered and become malignant, causing cancer. Prion proteins can fold defectively and become malignant, turning into prions, which is a disease. However, unlike cancer, prions can be transmitted to other living beings. Prions are proteins with an abnormal shape that cause diseases, are transmissible, and can be accidentally produced by our body. Normally, when a produced protein has a defect, our body has mechanisms to destroy these misfolded proteins. In fact, this process is the biochemical equivalent of cutting paper with scissors or passing a sheet of paper through a shredder. And this is what happens to most misfolded proteins, except for prions. Prions are not destroyed by our cells. They manage to escape the system that destroys defective proteins. And that's where prion infection arises. And this is where things start to get strange. A prion infection is neither a virus, nor a bacterium, nor a fungus, and it doesn't even have genetic code. So how do prions multiply without having the genetic code that the rest of life uses to multiply? How can this even be transmitted? How does a single protein do all this on its own? When prions bind to other normal proteins, they transform the normal proteins into prions. So prions are not multiplying, but rather modifying the proteins that already exist in your body and transforming them into new prions. An infection caused by a prion is nothing more than an alteration of normal proteins. It takes just a single prion to alter the surrounding normal proteins and create more prions, which can then alter nearby proteins and transform them into more prions as well. And then the rest you already know. The structural alteration of a prion can be replicated in other normal proteins, which spreads prions throughout the body and triggers the disease. You know that saying about one rotten orange spoiling all the others? It's basically that. A prion that folds incorrectly will cause other prions to fold incorrectly when it binds to normal prion proteins. And then the disease can set in and cause damage, especially in the central nervous system. And this explains how prions multiply and how they cause disease. But how exactly do prions pass from one living being to another? How severe is the disease? Let's start with the most famous example. Do you remember hearing news about mad cow disease? Mad cow disease, which is bovine spongiform encephalopathy, affects bulls and cows. The disease can occur spontaneously when a normal prion protein in a cow becomes misfolded, and then it ends up causing neurological changes in the animal. That story of turning the brain into a sponge. This is how a prion disease can start without needing to have been transmitted. But as I mentioned earlier, the disease can also be contracted, like an infection. And one way this happens is when herds are fed with feed made from the viscera of animals that contain prions. In other words, if a prion enters the animal's body from outside, it will produce more prions using the animal's normal prion proteins, and a prion infection will begin. When cases of mad cow disease appear, it is recommended not to consume the meat of these animals due to the risk of humans becoming infected. In other words, consuming a prion can trigger the chain reaction of transforming your own proteins into prions, initiating the infection. And this is how prions can contaminate other animals from an initially infected animal. Macbeth himself may have become infected by consuming contaminated meat. In Shakespeare's work, Before the Symptoms Manifest, Macbeth encounters a trio of strange sisters who offer him potions containing animal and human viscera. Exactly the type of organs and tissues that can carry infectious prions. It's not clear if Macbeth actually consumed the potions, but if he did, he could very well have contracted a prion infection. So here's the lesson. Be careful with mysterious potions from strange witches. To make matters worse, if a piece of meat is contaminated with prions, cooking it wouldn't help as it would with other types of infections. Prions are resistant to the heat of your kitchen fire and also to the cold of your freezer. There is no usual cooking process that destroys prions. It's not easy to destroy prions and prevent the disease. Infectious prions are even resistant to digestion. Not even the acid in your stomach destroys them. Because of this, cases of mad cow disease are frequently monitored, often leading to the suspension of the sale of possibly contaminated food. Preventing prions from spreading is important because there is no good way to destroy them. And just like cattle, the greatest danger is that we humans can also get prion infections. Prion diseases in humans are not so different from the encephalopathies that cattle and sheep suffer from prions. The central nervous system is full of proteins that can become prions. And if prions get there, they will make more prions using the proteins that already exist in your brain. Prions are truly brain destroyers. For example, creutzfeldt-jakob disease is a type of spongiform encephalopathy that affects humans. And in this disease, the brain disorder usually leads to dementia and a series of other symptoms. Problems such as insomnia, sleep disorders, emotional changes, visual and auditory hallucinations, tremors, seizures. In fact, if Macbeth had contracted creutzfeldt-jakob disease due to the mysterious potion, he would have exhibited the exact symptoms he shows in the play. Shakespeare obviously didn't know about these prion proteins that can cause diseases, but he probably used real stories as a basis for Macbeth's symptoms. Shakespeare may have accidentally created a case of prion disease without even knowing about the disease. And it's fascinating how the advancement of our knowledge can change how we look at things written centuries ago, when we had no idea how infectious diseases worked. Less fictional but equally tragic is the story of the Fore tribe that inhabits Papua New Guinea. The tribe suffered from a notable number of cases of a neurodegenerative disease they called kuru. The initial hypothesis was that the disease was hereditary, which is why it affected so many members of the same tribe. But the anthropologist Daniel Carlton Gajdusek investigated the disease more deeply and noticed the similarities between kuru and diseases like mad cow disease and scrapie. Gajdusek was able to use the remains of tribe members decimated by kuru to infect primates, and he proved that the disease was contagious. The Fore tribe practiced cannibalism, and they were unknowingly eating contaminated remains. So much so that when the tribe stopped practicing cannibalism, the cases of kuru disease ceased. At the time, prions were not known. But in retrospect, it is clear that the story of the Fore tribe is an example of prion infection spreading through the consumption of contaminated meat. Gajdusek received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1976 for his work. So now that we know where prions come from and how they spread, including in humans, only one question remains. How exactly do prions affect our body? In prion diseases, the brain is the most affected area precisely because it is an organ that contains a high concentration of normal prion protein. But how exactly does a misfolded prion destroy an entire brain? In the brain, the prion will transform normal prion proteins into prions, which are the abnormal proteins. And each new prion will be able to transform other proteins into more prions, generating a chain reaction. First, the normal prion proteins become reduced in number, and then they are not available to perform their normal functions. Furthermore, the abnormal proteins generated by prions will accumulate in insoluble protein aggregates that the body cannot destroy. What follows is the death of nerve cells, which are the cells that make up your brain and central nervous system. One of the probable causes of cell death is the formation of vacuoles, which are like bubbles inside the brain cells. And these bubbles may form due to the excess copper in the cells, which would normally have been removed by normal prion proteins, but have now turned into prions. And then the brain cells start dying, and neurological functions deteriorate over time, generating the type of symptoms that Macbeth had until his death, which was caused by a rival and not by prions. Currently, diseases caused by prions result in disease progression and death. We do not know how to treat prion diseases, which is scary. But don't worry. Diseases caused by prions are very, very rare. The sporadic form of the disease is the most common, and it occurs with the spontaneous formation of a prion in the body. The frequency of this happening is about 1 case per 1 million people per year. The hereditary form of the disease and the transmissible forms are even rarer. Even though there is a possibility of contracting a prion infection by consuming meat or through a blood transfusion, this possibility is minimal. Prions are definitely among the worst diseases that can infect a human being. The idea of slowly losing your mental capacities is quite frightening. And it's no wonder that Shakespeare used the type of symptoms that prions generate as a way to create drama in his story. But prions exist, and that is a truth we cannot change. What we can do is study the disease more deeply, and maybe one day develop treatments or ways to prevent it. In the past, diseases like tuberculosis were fatal, and today there are adequate treatments. So this video is not the end of the story of prions. We still have many discoveries to make. And who knows, in a few years I might make a new version of this video, but at the end, explaining a possible cure. To thank you, or not to thank you? That is the question.